I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast.
Hey there, dear listeners. As promised last week, I am back feeling better, but as I said, sounding worse. So if y'all don't mind toughing it out through a little bit of nasally sound and some scratchy voice, let's go ahead and do a proper episode today. We're on episode 158. Let's go ahead and get started. A new era of Nauvoo Mormonism was beginning to dawn in 1843, but only the truly adept could see the tides shifting. The polygamy revelation was on paper. It had been presented to the High Council and accepted. Those who didn't accept it were amidst being dealt with. Those who did enjoyed the next degree of celestial glory on this earth in small prayer meetings with the most trusted Nauvoo Mormon elite. This new Mormonism, though, could only exist in the shadows of the public facade. Only polygamy initiates could converse with other polygamists, as any leak could prove disastrous. Quote, "We hardly dared speak of it. The very walls had ears. We only spoke of it in whispers," recalled Zina Diantha Huntington, Jacobs, Smith, Young in 1898. The general membership could, they could speak their rumors all that they wanted, but as Wilford Woodruff reminisced in 1892, quote, "Of course there was things manifestly that the church was not to know, that they were not to reveal to the church, or were to be revealed not to the church," end quote. It was a hard balance to strike. People are terrible at keeping secrets, but dozens were practitioners and hundreds were aware of polygamy. How long until the hushed whispers of the thousands would grow into a torrential rage of antebellum fury and rent the church in twain? Well, we need to understand the scope and logistics of plural marriage in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith personally oversaw every single polygamous marriage, often picking the plural wives for his most trusted elites as rewards for absolute fealty. Hard numbers are kind of tough to come by. Historians have extensively studied and documented Joseph Smith's many wives, ranging from 20-something to 80-something, with best estimates putting the number in the middle 30s. But the practice of polygamy wasn't just limited to Joe, Bloody Brigham, and William Clayton. Historian Gary James Bergera has tirelessly put together a 75-page article on the available evidence for plural marriages in Nauvoo prior to the death of Joseph Smith, which I'm going to be relying heavily on for this episode, and you're going to find this article linked in the show notes. It's out of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. So if names of Mormon historians aren't your forte, Gary Bergera is the managing director of the Smith Pettit Foundation and the former managing director of Signature Books, which is one of the most prestigious publishing companies in the field of Mormon history academia. Gary Bergera has written a number of important articles on the Joseph Smith era Mormonism, along with a small handful of well-renowned books in the field, including Joseph Smith's Quorum of the Anointed, 1842-45, and the Nauvoo Endowment Company's 1845-46. So this article we'll be discussing today from Gary Bergera is titled Identifying the Earliest Mormon Polygamists, 1841 to 44, and it was published in the winter 2005 edition of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Once again, you will find this article in the show notes if you care to see the primary source for today's show. So let's discuss let's begin this discussion with talking about the quality of evidence when it comes to these polygamous marriages. There isn't much. We have the Book of the Law of the Lord, we have William Clayton's journal, Wilford Woodruff's journal, and the Nauvoo High Council minutes. But these sources will occasionally contain small lines of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, WAS to somebody, and then the names will sometimes be included, other times they're redacted. Of course, WAS means wedded and sealed, signifying a polygamous marriage. But the early Mormons were incessant document keepers, but they also knew how illegal and controversial it was for them to keep documentation on these marriages. So it was usually obscured or was never recorded in the first place in case these documents fell into the hands of enemies of the church. What does that leave us with in documenting polygamous marriages outside of Joe's various marriages? Well, journals, mostly. Journals are the single most crucial piece of documentary history that historians have access to, and there were quite a few journal keepers in Nauvoo. Journals and letters are basically the only contemporary sources. Beyond that, later mentions, whether directly referenced or obliquely referenced, and occasional affidavits and, court testimonies and stuff, those provide the next best source. Although this can always be problematic because memories can change, memories can fade, and people's stance in the church can evolve or shift from friendly to enemy to, ambiguous. So with all of those qualifiers in mind, let's discuss the fragmentary evidence of polygamous marriages outside of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo that was compiled by Gary James Bergera. Today's episode is going to be going in, it's actually, the whole episode is basically an alphabetical data dump. But stick around for the conclusion so we can draw some actual analyses from this data dump. We'll discuss each of the leaders of the Nauvoo Church. We'll provide a brief character sketch of each of them and how they are important and where they came into the timeline. And then we'll discuss the evidence used to conclude that they practiced polygamy before Joe and Hiram's deaths in Carthage. Just as a precursor, this is the late antebellum period of America, and women were possessions, okay? The information will be presented in accordance with that perspective, but I'm going to try my best to equalize the language as much as I can. The fact of the matter is, Mormonism in Nauvoo operated on prosperity gospel. The most righteous were the most prosperous. Well, I should say maybe not the most righteous, but the most loyal were the most prosperous, and therefore were given the largest plots of land, the best horses, the nicest carriages, and of course, the most beautiful wives. So let's begin with James Adams. James Adams was born in 1783 in Connecticut. He was a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Black Hawk War. He held various positions in government from that time forward. He was baptized into the church in 1840, where he was the deputy grand master of the Second Grand Masonic Lodge of Illinois in Springfield. He became a regent of the University of Nauvoo in 1841. He became a branch president in 1842 in Springfield, and later became a patriarch of the church. Now, this guy, we actually mentioned him last episode. Well, not last episode when I called in sick, but the episode before that. This is the guy that died 4 days after his election to office of probate judge of Hancock County in August 1843. So evidence for Adams being in a plural marriage actually comes from a very late affidavit from the late 1860s as part of Joseph F. Smith's pro-polygamy propaganda campaign in order to combat Joseph Smith III's prophetic claims when he was, new president of the RLDS Church. So a woman named Ruxina Higby Repshire testified that, quote, on the 11th day of July, A.D. 1843, at the city of Nauvoo, county of Hancock, state of Illinois, she was married to James Adams for time and all eternity by President Joseph Smith, end quote. She had one sister wife, Harriet Denton, for the entire month that she was married to James Adams while he was alive. So Ruxina apparently had another husband at this time that she was married, plurally, to Adams, but apparently they were estranged. This first husband, Daniel Mayhope Repshire, also married another woman in the Nauvoo Temple in January of 1846, and she was 22 years his junior. So that's James Adams. Let's talk about Ezra T. Benson. Ezra T. Benson is, I believe, the grandfather, possibly the great-grandfather of Ezra Taft Benson, who was prophet from 1985 to 1994. So Ezra T. Benson was an early church convert, although there's very little available information on him in the Nauvoo era. So Ezra Benson did serve as a captain of a handcart company to Utah in 1849. He was a member of one of the early pioneer treks that was out to settle the Utah territory. Ezra Benson's civil wife at this time was named Pamelia Andrews. She testified in 1869 of the details of her sealing to Ezra by Hiram sidekick Abiff Smith on November 19, 1843, with her sister Adeline Andrews present as a witness. Pamelia testified, quote, and further, on the 27th day of April, A.D. 1844, at the same place, she was present and witnessed to the marrying or sealing of her sister Adeline to her husband, Ezra T. Benson, by President Hiram Smith, end quote. So this sister-in-law, sister-wife sealing was one of the latest sealings that Hiram performed prior to his death in Carthage. Ezra was sealed to his wife a few months after the polygamy revelation was read to the High Council, and a few months after that, he was sealed to his sister-in-law. Next on this list, by Gary Bergera is Reynolds Cahoon. Now, this is a name that hopefully some of you recognize from our timeline and from hearing in Mormon history circles. Now, I've been contacted by descendants of Reynolds Cahoon who have listened to this show. Well, Cahoon was an OG Kirtland-era Mormon, okay? This guy was born in 1790, was a veteran of the War of 1812, and he was baptized into the church by the first mission troop to Kirtland by the inimitable P-cubed Parley Parker Pratt in November of 1830. That was less than a year after the Book of Mormon was published. Now, Reynolds Cahoon has been here through thick and thin of the church, serving missions, serving as counselor to Bishop Newell K. Whitney. He was in the Kirtland Stake Presidency. He was counselor in the Stake Presidency of Adamond in Missouri. He was a member of the Nauvoo Legion. He served on the Temple Building Committee. He's a member of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, and he'll also be inducted into the Council of 50 when it's formed early next year in 1844. Now, Reynolds Cahoon apparently just had one plural wife that can be documented, but that information only comes from family tradition, which understandably has many issues. According to Cahoon family tradition, Reynolds married Lucinda Roberts Johnson in either late 1841 or early 1842. Lucinda was a widow of 3 years at that point. Now, the dating here is really important because it reveals Reynolds' rank in the Nauvoo elite. You see, most of the marriages we're discussing today happened in 1843 or 44, when Doctrine and Covenants section 132, the polygamy revelation, was actually committed to paper, and that revelation could be shown to prospective wives that polygamy was the commandment of God's. The fact that Reynolds took his plural wife prior to the revelation being committed to paper, and even before Hiram Smith reportedly knew of the doctrine, reveals that Reynolds Cahoon was truly in the highest echelon of the Mormon elite, above nearly every other guy that we're talking about today. Bergera's article next turns towards Joseph W. Coolidge. This guy was born in Maine, 10 years younger than Joseph Smith. He joined the church in early 1838 and moved to Caldwell County as tensions in the Missouri Mormon War were just beginning to fester. Joseph Coolidge was a member of the Nauvoo Legion. He was later inducted into the Council of 50, and after the Schism crisis, he moved to Iowa, where he made a life for himself and his wives before dying there in 1871, never joining the Mormons in Utah. Right before his death, Joseph Coolidge sat down with Joseph F. Smith and discussed his Nauvoo marriages. Joseph F. Smith recorded the conversation in his journal as such, quote, Joseph Smith had sealed more than one wife to Joseph W. Coolidge, and he, meaning Coolidge, knew as he said what he spoke. I record this testimony of a man who has not been with the church for more than 20 years. End quote. Who was this second wife Coolidge was sealed to? Well, he'd been civilly married to an Elizabeth Buchanan in 1834, but sometime most likely in 1843 or 44, Coolidge was also sealed to his sister-in-law, Mary Ann Buchanan, Elizabeth's younger sister. This was not the first, nor will it be the last instance of a man being sealed to his sisters-in-law as plural wives in Nauvoo. Now, that's an interesting pattern that we're going to continue to watch emerge, but we'll forego commenting on for right now anyway. Howard Egan is the next subject of our focus. Now, Howard Egan was an immigrant from Ireland who'd moved to Quebec, Canada in 1825. Now, Egan is interesting and has a tragic childhood behind him, and there's actually a fair amount of family tradition and folklore online about this guy that is maintained by the Egan family. So when Egan was only 8 years old, his mother died while he was 6th of 11 children. That's when his father packed up all the kids except for one and headed to Canada. But upon their arrival, it wasn't 2 months before 3 of Howard Egan's siblings had died. Then in 1828, when Howard was just 13 years old, his father died, leaving 6 children in Canada orphaned, including Howard. Howard continued to grow up and eventually became a sailor around the age of 15. At the age of 23, Egan made his way to Salem, Massachusetts, and learned the trade of rope making. This is where he met Tamsin Parsley, and they were married. Howard was about 24 years old at this time, and Tamsin was 15, which that wasn't terribly uncommon at the time. In 1842, with their 2 sons, the Egans were baptized into the church by Erastus Snow, and they moved to Nauvoo, where Howard continued his rope-making career. Now, Just briefly, a personal anecdote here. Back in 2017, when I did the Mormon history tour all the way across the country, my brief time in Nauvoo included stopping at the reconstructed Nauvoo Community Center, which is just this massive room with all sorts of, community activities from the period in it. They have bread making, wagon wheel banding, yarn spinning, and plenty of other activities that are recreated by missionaries who are wearing period-looking clothing. One of these exhibits is rope making. Now, it's cool because it's this wooden contraption where you attach 3 strands of string from one spool of string to one end of this large spinning arm. Then you attach the other end of it to a static board on the other side of the contraption. Then the rope maker sets the contraption in motion. The whole thing spins while keeping the string taut the whole time, which weaves the 3 strings together into a rope. It spins this until you have an acceptable length of rope, and then you tie a very, very small string around the end in order to keep it from unraveling. And of course, you can repeat the process with ropes in order to make thicker and thicker and thicker ropes, right? Now, the whole process is really, really cool. But the older gentleman missionary who spun my length of rope was, let's just say interesting. He was dressed up in like his bloomers and his long sleeve shirt with like a scarf tie looking thing. And, it looked like he was dressed up for Trek, Pioneer Trek or something. But I could tell that this guy, probably in his mid 60s, was so done with his mission. It was hilarious. He barely spoke a word the whole time. The thing is, it was off season. I was the only guy in the building there, and I could tell that this missionary did not want to spin a rope for just one dude in an almost empty building with just 2 other missionaries who were at other stations. He refused to make eye contact the whole time and just barked out each and every little thing that he did. Here's the string. You attach it here. You spin the wheel. Here's your rope. Get out of my face. It was magical. So if you're ever in Nauvoo, be sure to go into the community center and get your length of rope, even though it does happen to make your car smell like gasoline. I'm not really sure why that is. Anyway, so Howard Egan, he was a rope spinner, a rope maker. He ended up becoming a captain in the Nauvoo Legion, but he also additionally served as a Nauvoo policeman, which was even a more prestigious rank in Nauvoo. He also worked on the temple building committee. So this guy, Howard Egan, he wasn't with the church very long before he was already one of the chosen elites. So his second wife was Catherine Reese Clausen, a widow of 5 years at the time of their marriage in early 1844. Now, Catherine had 6 children from her previous marriage, and she was 40 years of age. These 2 people were sealed together by Hiram's sidekick of Biff Smith sometime in early 1844. Howard Egan remained with Tamsen and Catherine as his wives in Nauvoo, where he also married 2 other wives after the deaths of Joe and Hiram. Interestingly enough, Catherine left him in 1852 while they were in Utah. They were members of the very first wagon train that entered the valley in 1847. Altogether, the Egan family is a really interesting family. So Bergera's article next talks of William Felshaw. Now, this guy is pretty obscure, and the only document with his name on it that's available in the Joseph Smith papers is a land deed that is dated to him June 30th, 1836, from Joe and Emma, meaning that, he was probably a member of the church then and was probably with the church through Missouri and Nauvoo era as well. But apparently, William Felshaw was sealed to Charlotte Walters on July 28, 1843. She was 24 years his junior when they were married. When their marriage was resealed in the Nauvoo Temple, they had their first daughter with them, which alludes to a May of 1844 sealing when they consummated the marriage, and one of the latest plural marriages performed by Joe or Hiram before they died in Carthage. Now, the next focus is William D. Huntington. Now, so William D. Huntington and his brother Dimmick Huntington are people who have made plenty of appearances in our timeline. So to put this guy into context, we need to go back to his dad, William Huntington. We have William D. Huntington and William Huntington. And I spent hours tracking this down without things making sense. Everything just seemed really off before I finally realized that they just wanted to confuse future historians by naming their kids the same name as themselves. So William Huntington, William D. Huntington's dad, was born back in 1784 in New Hampshire. He married Zina Baker in 1806, after which he served in the War of 1812. He joined and left the Presbyterian Church and a few other churches at the time. Then he stumbled upon the Book of Mormon sometime in 1832 or 33 when he heard some Mormon preachers, and he bought a copy for himself. He and Zina were baptized into the church in 1835 by an elder Dutcher. He and his family moved to Kirtland in late 1836, where he bought a farm from Jacob Bump for $3,000. Now, okay, brief pause. So the reason why we're just going through all of these character sketches is because there's a fair amount of documentation, biographical documentation that's available on all of these people. And if we're just talking about numbers, just the straight numbers of polygamous marriages that were going on in Nauvoo in this era in 1843 to 44, and, a couple of years earlier than that, then the human element seems to fade away from our focus. So the reason I'm providing all of these character sketches is to humanize the people who were involved. Unfortunately, that almost requires only providing character sketches of the men because the women largely are not accounted for. I don't know how else to say that. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of this situation. The men were the ones who were signing land deeds. The men were the ones who were recorded in the getting their elder's license and their preaching license. The men were often the ones who were recorded as them being baptized when it was their whole family being baptized. So that's unfortunately a limitation of the data that we're working with. So back to the Huntington family. They became embroiled in lawsuits as the Kirtland Safety Society broke apart, and the Huntington family home actually became a safe house for Joe Sr., Big Daddy Cheese as we know him, and Hiram Smith and some of the other Smith family members as they put their affairs in order to flee Kirtland for Missouri in early 1838. The Huntington family made their way to far west then Adiamant in Missouri in May or June of 1838, where they had a rough go. When the twin Mormon cities surrendered after the Haun's Mill massacre and the cities were surrounded by some 3,000 to 5,000 Missouri militiamen, William Huntington was put in charge of one of the committees to document the worth of the Mormon property in Missouri as the Mormons fled to Quincy that winter of 38 to 39. After that, the William Huntington family was one of the first to live in the swamp of Commerce, Illinois, which would later become Nauvoo. The entire Huntington family is crucial to the Mormon history timeline as Zina Diantha Huntington and Priscilla Lathrop Huntington were two of Joe's wives, marriages for which Dimmick Huntington actually bore witness and later testified to the fact that those marriages were consummated. Joe couldn't just partake of the sacred fruit of the new and everlasting covenant without his brother-in-law, William D., partaking in it as well. So accordingly, William D. Huntington was sealed to Caroline Clark, his first civil wife since 1839, and his sister-in-law, Harriet Clark, likely in early 1843. Next, we focus on Orson Hyde. Now, Orson Lahiden really needs no introduction to our timeline, but he was an OG Kirtland Mormon. We did an episode about the conflict generated when Orson learned of his own wife's marriage to Joe, Nancy Marinda Johnson or Marinda Nancy Johnson. But that happened while Orson was on a mission to Jerusalem in order to dedicate the Holy Land for Mormon purposes or something to that effect. So in September of 1869, Orson Hyde gave this affidavit, quote, I, Orson Hyde, do hereby certify and declare, according to my best recollection, that on the 4th day of September I was married to Miss Marinda N. Johnson, Marinda Nancy Johnson, in Kirtland, Ohio, in the year of our Lord, 1834. And in the month of February or March, I was married to Miss Martha R. Browett by Joseph Smith, the martyred prophet, and by him she was sealed to me for time and for all eternity in Nauvoo, Illinois. And in the month of April of the same year, 1843, I was married by the same person to Mrs. Mary Ann Pierce. Mary Ann Price, my mistake, and by him she was sealed to me for time and for all eternity in Nauvoo, Illinois, while the woman to whom I was first married was yet living, and gave her cordial consent to both transactions, and was personally present to witness the ceremonies." End quote. Gary Bergera's article also includes a memoir from Mary Ann Price Hyde from the 1880s, which corroborates this account. And it is quite remarkable. Joe had roughly, 33 wives or something like that by the time of his death, but it was extremely rare for another man in Nauvoo to have more than one plural wife living for understandable reasons. You see, sure, like Joe could hide how many wives he has, but if every guy in town has dozens of wives, where do they all come from? How do they keep it secret? The more guys with more wives, the harder it is to keep it quiet, right? Orson Hyde having 3 plural wives prior to the Carthage assassinations reveals that he was one of the more favored of Nauvoo elite, which likely had something to do with him sharing Marinda Nancy with the prophet. That's kind of speculative, but I think there's some reasoning behind that. So next we focus on a guy named Joseph A. Kelting. There really isn't much available on this guy either, but we know that he was born October 3rd, 1811 in Philadelphia. When he became an adult, he worked as a sheriff, a merchant, a gristmill owner, an attorney, a number of other trades. He was a Joseph of all trades, you might say. So Joseph Kelting first married Elizabeth Martin civilly in September of 1832, before either of them ever heard of Mormonism. The Kelting family converted sometime in 1835 or 1836, and Joseph was ordained an elder in May of 1836. Now, records get a bit fuzzy after that, but the Kelting family shows up again in Nauvoo by 1843. Joseph Kelting is interesting because he was one of the people who volunteered for the mission to Oregon and California in order to find a new place for the Mormons to settle. That was a mission created during Joe's lifetime, but not executed because it would fall to bloody Brigham Young to see it through after the Carthage shootout. Now, a few missions were created for this purposes, including Texas, where the peyote grows like sagebrush. Lyman White was called to fulfill that mission, and he built his congregation out there, the Whiteites, as a result of it. So Joseph Kelting here eventually went with the Mormons to Utah, where he became a territorial district attorney. He served a mission to Australia during the Mormon Reformation era, and then eventually moved his families out to California, where they lived their polygamous lives the rest of their days in peace away from the Mormon Empire. In September 1903, long after he'd left the church, Joseph Kelting gave an affidavit that connected him with polygamy prior to the Carthage shootout. Quote, "I first knew Joseph Smith the prophet in Ohio. I once called upon him afterwards at his residence in Nauvoo, Illinois, and told him I wanted a private interview. We walked upstairs together. His wife, Emma, was downstairs, and he did not wish her to hear what we were going to talk about. We went into the front room, and he locked the door. I told him it was mooted about that he was teaching plural marriage, and asked him the question, 'Are you mooting plural marriage?' His answer was, 'Cannot answer you, as you are both a lawyer and a sheriff of Hancock County, and it might militate against you as an officer as well as against us.' I said, 'Joseph, whatever you tell me as your friend is safe. I came here to find this out, and I assure you upon the square,' and we were both Masons, 'it shall never injure you in any shape.' 'I did moot plural marriage,' said the prophet. 'Did you have a revelation to teach this?' I asked. 'I did,' he answered. 'Have you more than one wife sealed to you by this authority?' I asked. 'I have,' said he. After giving me this information, he referred me to Brigham Young if I wanted any more on this subject. Brigham seemed to be the man he trusted most with this matter, and was putting him to the front. The prophet assured me that the revelation was as authoritative and binding as any revelation given through him up to that time, and, in fact, that it was paramount to all the rest." End quote. In a separate affidavit from a few years prior, Joseph Kelting said, quote, "A short time after this interaction, I married 2 wives in that order of marriage." End quote. This purported interaction and the timing of it is quite fascinating, especially when compared with his affidavit from 1894, where Joe was the one to bring up the issue instead of Kelting. But there are some interesting details to tease out of this, especially given the timing of spring of 1844. First off, according to this interaction, Emma was specifically excluded from hearing the conversation. See, she knew some things, but not most things, right? Joe was keeping her on a need-to-know basis, and that was probably the only way that he could keep peace in the home. Secondly, Joseph Kelting was the one who aimed the question at Joe. Are you propagating the plural wives doctrine? To which Joe was apprehensive to answer, but loved when the question came up because he got the opportunity to brag about how many wives he has. There are multiple people who attested to that. So Joe told Kelting that his position as a law enforcement officer made it so that he couldn't share with Kelting what was really going on. But upon Kelting's issuance of a Masonic sign, Joe came clean. Then for Joe to push the matter to Bloody Brigham is quite interesting as well, isn't it? Now, the third thing that I find really fascinating about this interaction is what it tells us about how the doctrine was passed around. The previous affidavit says in part, quote, "After we entered the room, he locked the door and then asked me if I had heard the rumors connecting him with polygamy. I told him I had. He then began a defense of the doctrine by referring to the Old Testament." End quote. You see, rumors of polygamy were rampant, but what this affidavit reveals is that Joe relied on those rumors to prime people to accept of the doctrine of polygamy. Look, if Joe just walked up to somebody one day on the street and told them, you need to take a second or third wife, apropos of nothing, they would think he was bonkers, right? But because rumors of polygamy were circulating for years before this revelation was committed to paper, when he would teach somebody of the practice and give them the Old Testament justification for it, they'd already heard all of the rumors and they'd probably be more ready to accept of it. You see, that was always this balance that Joe and his fellow initiates had to strike. You decry the rumors publicly, you converse about the practice discreetly, and then confirm the rumors only to those who can be trusted. It's not a very sustainable model, is it? It was only a matter of time before something like History of the Saints by John C. Reckitt-Bennett, if you're a supporter over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, of course, you can listen to the audiobook of that with commentary, or, the Nauvoo Expositor, other of these exposés came along and they exposed the perceived sexual deviancy of the Mormon Empire. So, I got to say, I just simply found Joseph Kelting's story to be interesting. There's a lot to learn from him and his affidavits about Nauvoo polygamy prior to June of 1844. Now, Gary Bergera's article next focuses on Heber the Creeper Kimball. Now, we're going to forego discussing Heber Kimball for now because Kimball's polygamous marriages are a massive issue in and of themselves that are going to require some time to deal with. Instead, let's turn to the next person that Bergera's article discusses, and that is Isaac Morley. Isaac Morley is super interesting, and he's another one of these early OG Morms from the Kirtland era. He was the guy who had a farm just a few miles outside of Kirtland where they practiced communalism before Joseph Smith was even on the scene. Another little anecdote from the Mormon History Tour. You can go to the remade Morley farmhouse that they have there. You can go walking through the woods to see the schoolhouse that they had where, Cody Nakoni and I have found this claim from Jesse Jasper Moss when they were practicing their prayer circles there in this Morley schoolhouse that he snuck in and tried to steal one of the bottles of wine because he thought it was drugged. That was all happening on the Morley farm here. And this anecdote here, you can go to the Morley farm today. It's staffed with missionaries, and you can go in there and talk to them and hear the stories. And interestingly enough, when I was attending and talking to the missionaries there were actually a couple of young girls there. One of them was about 11, one of them was about 14. And when I was talking, or when the missionaries were telling the story of the Morley farm to these girls, they told them about Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, and told the story of Mary Elizabeth getting the Book of Mormon from Isaac Morley. And she took the Book of Mormon home and she read it and read it and read it all through the night. And she even memorized the first chapter of it. And then she came back to Isaac Morley and, said, he said, I don't think you read a single page of that book. And then she began reciting the first chapter and he was blown away. And he said, you know what? You can keep that Book of Mormon. And then Joseph Smith met Mary Elizabeth Rollins when he first got to Kirtland in 1831, when she was just a mere 12 years old. And this missionary looked at the 12-year-old girl and said, she was about your age when she met the prophet. And he said, where did you get this Book of Mormon? I gave this to Brother Morley. And then he said, "Oh, it's okay, you can have it," and he made a gift of the book to her. Apparently, the missionaries just neglected to add that Joseph Smith was grooming her at the time, and she would become one of Joseph Smith's wives at the age of 19. Just thought that was, interesting that Mormon missionaries will tell the story of Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, but fail to disclose that really important detail of her later life. Anyway, continuing on. Isaac Morley was one of the Rignonites from the mid-1820s, right? He was another guy who was baptized into the church by the first mission troop. PQ to Parley Parker Pratt. He was the guy who dunked Isaac Morley. And that was less than a year after the Book of Mormon was published. The Morley farm was where the Smith family first lived upon their arrival to Kirtland in 1831. Isaac Morley was born back in 1786. He'd married Lucy Gunn in 1812, right before serving in the War of 1812, and he held some interesting, deistic universalist ideas, which, made him receptive to the Book of Mormon's overall message. Isaac Morley eventually gave up his farm control to the church for the purposes of supporting the poorest of the converts and immigrants from the further eastern states. And that's when the Morley family made their way out to Missouri in late 1831, where they settled, and Isaac was given various leadership positions in the Whitmer Church out there. He's eventually appointed a bishop in 1838. He was a member of the Missouri High Council. Prior to the Missouri Mormon War, he was ordained a patriarch to the church by Joe, Hiram, and Hinchpin Rigdon in November of 1837. Morley was there in Missouri throughout the war, and eventually he was exterminated with the rest of the Mormons in 1838 to 39. He actually founded another communalistic town near Nauvoo in 1839 called Yellrum. You get it? Yellrum? Morley. Yellrum is Morley backwards. A clever little code there, only known to the adepts. It's funny because it's like Mormonism is many things, and a boys club in a treehouse with like a no girls allowed sign spelled Gurlz. Mormonism is definitely one of those boys club. So anyway, notably, after Eliza R. Snow and Emma had their falling out in early 1842, Eliza actually moved to the Morley settlement to live in one of the commune homes there. And also interesting, after the deaths of Joe and Hiram, the burning of the Morley settlement and Bloody Brigham's reaction to it will be one of the major issues that we'll discuss moving forward. So, Isaac Morley was one of the earliest and highest ranking elites in Mormonism from the Kirtland era. It's understandable that he would be granted multiple wives for his loyalty to the prophet and the theocratic cause of the religion. And because, of course, he had this very much communalistic idea of like, share everything. Everything is free, an abundance principle. So Gary Bergera notes in his article that evidence for Morley's plural marriage is, quote, inferential and based on family tradition, which that makes it kind of problematic, right? But the first of these was noted by Eliza R. Snow in her Nauvoo journal when she records her sister Abigail Lenora Snow Levitt as A.L. Morley. Now, according to Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, that's Eliza Snow's biographer, Abigail was Isaac Morley's scribe when he gave Eliza her patriarchal blessing in 1843. Isaac and Abigail Lenora were likely married sometime in September of 1843. Now, his third marriage, second plural marriage, was to Hannah B. Finch Merriam in January of 1844. Interestingly, Hannah was a widow of 2 years when she and Isaac Morley were sealed. So, in exchange for Isaac taking multiple wives, Isaac's daughter, Cordelia Morley, remembered in her biography, quote, plural marriage was introduced to me by my parents from Joseph Smith, asking their consent and a request to me to be his wife. Imagine, if you can, my feelings to be a plural wife, something I never thought I ever could. I knew nothing of such religion and could not accept it, neither did I, end quote. So similarly to the Kimball family with Violet and Helen Mar Kimball, Cordelia Morley was propositioned to by Joseph Smith, but Cordelia's opposition to polygamy didn't matter too much because she was sealed to Joseph Smith after his death in the Nauvoo Temple by Bloody Brigham Young or by Heber the Creeper Kimball. I'm not sure which of them performed the sealing. So that's Isaac Morley, the Morley family. Next, our gaze turns to Joseph Bates Noble. Joseph Noble is really interesting because he's another one of these OG Kirtland Mormons. He lived in New York about 15 miles from the Smith family in a town called Penfield, and then moved to Bloomfield in 1828, which is just directly south of Penfield and about equidistant from the Palmyra, Manchester area where the Smiths were living. So Joseph Bates Noble was baptized into the church in 1832, moved to Kirtland in 1834. He was a participant in Zion's Camp, which was, the first military expedition of Joe and the Mormons. He was inducted into the First Quorum of the 70. He received his elder license in 1836. He moved to Far West sometime in 1838 and was a participant in the Army of Israel during the Missouri Mormon War. After the Mormons' surrender and exodus to Illinois, Joseph Bates Noble moved with his family to Iowa Territory, just across the Mississippi from Commerce, which of course later became Nauvoo. Here is where he officiated the first officially recognized plural marriage of Joseph Smith to his first officially recognized polygamous wife, Louisa Beeman, who was Joseph Bates Noble's sister-in-law. Joseph Bates Noble continued in the highest ranks of Nauvoo leadership. He was commissioned as a bishop in Nauvoo, a member of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, second lieutenant in the Iowa Territorial Militia, quartermaster sergeant in the Nauvoo Legion, and he remained with the Brighamite sect where he resided in Bountiful, Utah for most of the remainder of his days after being part of the first wagon train to Utah in 1847. He was even keeper of Joe's Nauvoo Legion sword after Joe's death, which can be seen exhibited online and occasionally from time to time in various local museums and whatnot. And Joe's Nauvoo Legion sword has basically taken on a mythology of its own. So Joseph Bates Noble was one of the first people Joe personally taught that a revelation on plural marriage existed. He learned in 1840 when Joe propositioned Louisa Beeman through Joseph Bates Noble. He told, "Hey, brother Joseph Bates Noble, hey, I really like that sister-in-law of yours. Can you pass her this little note that I made for her?" So Joe and Noble both recognized the gravity of this situation, as evidenced by an affidavit that Noble gave in June of 1869. Quote, "In the fall of the year AD 1840, Joseph Smith taught me the principle of celestial marriage, or a plurality of wives, and said that Joseph Smith declared that he had a revelation from God on the subject, and that the angel of the Lord had commanded him," meaning Joseph Smith, "to move forward in the said order of marriage, and further that the said Joseph Smith requested him," meaning Joseph Bates Noble, "to step forward and assist him in carrying out the said principle, saying, 'In revealing this to you, I have placed my life in your hands. Therefore, do not in an evil hour betray me to my enemies.'" End quote. So Joseph Bates Noble was an initiate as of late 1840 when he performed the marriage between Joe and Louisa Beeman. Joe rewarded his loyalty by granting him Sarah B. Alley as Noble's first plural wife. 10 months after their marriage, Sarah Alley gave birth to their first plural child, George. But of course, these marriages were done only for celestial purposes, not carnal, right? As Bergera documents it from William Clayton's journal, Noble didn't require much convincing to believe plural marriage was totes from God's. This is from Bergera's dialogue article. Quote, "Apparently Noble had hoped to marry sooner. According to William Clayton's diary for May 17, 1843, now quoting William Clayton, President Joseph Smith said to brother Benjamin Johnson that I, Joseph Bates Noble, when he was first taught this doctrine of plural marriage, set his heart on one potential plural wife and pressed Joseph to seal the contract, but he never could get the opportunity. It seemed that the Lord was unwilling. Finally, another potential plural wife came along, and he then engaged that one and is a happy man. I learned from this anecdote never to press the prophet, but wait with patience, and God will bring all things right." End quote. Once again, polygamy was viciously opposed by these holy and pious men of God, right? Carnal desire to have lots of women to have sex with that has absolutely no influence on either the doctrine being revealed or its practice as a whole, right? Philosophies of gods mingled with semen. That's how the old adage goes, right? So a few weeks after Joseph Bates Noble took Sarah Alley to wife, he took his third wife, Mary Ann Washburn. Our next subject of focus today is John E. Page. John Page was born in 1799 in New York, about a day's journey from the Palmyra, Manchester area. He was baptized into the church by Martin Harris's brother, Emer Harris, in August of 1833, where he married Lavona Stevens, his second wife after becoming a widower. He and Lavona moved to Kirtland in 1835, and he eventually became a member of the Quorum of Apostles in 1838. Now, John E. Page's second wife died, and he married again to a Mary Judd in January of 1839. Page continued to be a picture-perfect salesman for the church. He'd served missions in Canada, the eastern states, Pittsburgh, and he even published his own missionary pamphlet titled Gospel Light in 1843. He served an electioneering mission to Washington, D.C. in 1843 to 1844, and then was inducted into the Theocratic Council of 50 after Joe's death. Eventually, John Page came into disagreements with Bloody Brigham Young, and he was excommunicated from the church in June of 1846 when he joined the Strangite Church and became an editor for the Strangite paper. But that's, of course, all in the future from where we are now. So evidence for John E. Page's plural marriages comes from yet another interview conducted by Joseph F. Smith in the early 1900s. Smith interviewed Mary Judd, which was Page's third wife in serial monogamy. Here's a statement from Joseph F. Smith in Bergera's article. Quote, "In 1904, I went to the World's Fair in St. Louis. James G. Duffin was presiding over the Central States Mission at that time, and I went with him to see Mary Page Eaton, wife of John E. Page. She was an aged woman, and I was introduced to her. The two of us sat there and talked, and I questioned her about plural marriage. I asked her, 'Did John E. Page have wives other than you?' She replied, 'Yes.' I said, 'How did he get them?' She said, 'I gave them to him.' I said, 'How did you come to that?' She said, 'Well, he wanted them, and I gave them to him.' I said, 'Well, that was in the days of the prophet Joseph Smith?' She said, 'Yes, it was.'" End quote. So apparently Mary gave to John Page a woman named Nancy Bliss sometime in 1844. Marriage is bliss. But they separated soon after that. Mary Judd did, according to the law of Sarah, as most of the first wives involved in these relationships. She had to agree to the marriage or suffer damnation. I love how Joseph F. Smith asked her how John Page got more than one wife, and she said, I gave them to him, and he didn't follow up with and how did that make you feel? Because why would he ask something like that, right? Gary Bergera's article next focuses on some people that we're going to have to wait on. We're going to talk about later. Heber the Creeper Kimball is one of them. The plural relationships of P. Cubed, Parley Parker Pratt, Whiteout Willer Richards, and Hiram Sidekick Abiff Smith. All of those require more time than we can devote here. Instead, we're going to jump much further down in Bergera's article to Uncle John Smith. Now, Uncle John is actually a really interesting character in Mormon history that we've only obliquely referenced before. Basically, this guy was there from the beginning. He was Big Daddy Cheese's younger brother, born in 1781. He held many leadership positions throughout the church. He was father to George A. Smith, as well as Jesse Smith, who was the Smith who died during Zion's camp. Now, Uncle John Smith is actually one of the very few Smith men who ever actually had their photo taken. Now, well, from that generation anyway. Some people will claim that there's a picture circulating of Joseph Smith, but I personally don't find the evidence for it very convincing. William Smith, Joe's younger brother, William Smith, was the only other Smith of that generation who had a photo taken because all of the other Smiths were dead before photography was available enough to have their pictures easily taken. So anyway, Uncle John, he has basically been here from the beginning. He was one of the earliest converts in 1832 when he moved to Kirtland, Ohio. He was ordained a high priest. He served multiple missions. He held stock in the Kirtland Safety Society. He was appointed counselor to the first presidency in 1837. He moved to Adamine, Wyoming in 1838, where he was appointed president of the stake there. He was one of the coordinators of the Mormon Exodus from Missouri to Illinois and helped with a bunch of the planning and execution of the construction of Nauvoo. He was also inducted into the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge. He was appointed to be a stake president in Nauvoo and admitted to the Council of 50 when it was formed. Uncle John Smith was the only of the original generation of the Smiths to migrate to Salt Lake City, where he was ordained a patriarch of the church in 1849, the office that he retained for 5 years until his death in 1854 at the age of 72 years old. So Uncle John married Clarissa Lyman in September of 1815. His first polygamous marriage was to Mary Akins. They were married August 13th, 1843, which was just a few days after the plural marriage revelation was presented to the High Council. Mary Akins was a widow of 4 years with 3 children at the time. And now quoting from Bergera's article, quote, "About the same time as his plural marriage to Akins, John Smith was also sealed, according to Benjamin F. Johnson, to Julia Ellis Hills Johnson, who was Benjamin F. Johnson's mother." Now quoting Benjamin F. Johnson, quote, "My mother, having finally separated from my father by the suggestion or counsel of the prophet Joseph Smith, she accepted of and was sealed by him to Father John Smith. In this I felt not a little sorrow, for I loved my father and knew him to be naturally a kind and loving parent, a just and noble spirited man. But he had not obeyed the gospel, had fought it with his words, and as I knew a stream must have a fountain and does not rise above it, so I consoled myself, assured by the prophet's words that a better day would come to my father." End quote. So what this means is it presents a very complex and fascinating family dynamic. What I mean by that is Joseph Smith had married 2 of Julia Ellis Johnson's daughters, Delsina and Elmira, in May and June of 1843. Now, just 3 months after that, after Julia's daughters had been taken as the prophet's plural wives, Julia herself was given to Joe's uncle as his plural wife, which made Julia Ellis Johnson Joe's plural aunt, as well as his twice-over mother-in-law. You can't make this up, right? I mean, the whole thing is just so complex, and it's a wonder why family tree organizational charts from this era, if they actually incorporate all of the data, are so wacky and complex. So anyway, Julia Ellis, she's an interesting case. She had 16 surviving children from her previous marriage when she left her husband just prior to this sealing to Uncle John. However, these kids were all grown adults by this time. Benjamin was one of the youngest, and he was aged 24 when she was sealed to Uncle John. So Julia simply left her husband because Joe advised her to do so. Possibly her first husband wasn't right for her. Maybe he was abusive. Maybe they just decided that they didn't want to be married after 4.5 decades of marriage and raising 16 kids together. Maybe Joe thought she would be a perfect fit for his aging uncle and advised her to leave because her first husband never joined the church, while Julia was a faithful woman in the church since her baptism. Who knows what really happened here? But this was Uncle John's second wife. Notably, Uncle John Smith's progenitors are crucial to Utah and Mormon history. His son, George A. Smith, is the namesake for St. George, Utah. His son, George A. Smith's son, John Henry Smith, was a member of the Utah Territorial Legislature and served as second counselor to Joseph F. Smith in the presidency of the church until his death in 1911. His son, George Albert Smith, was eighth prophet of the church from 1945 until his death in 1951. 4 generations of prominent church leadership all came from Uncle John Smith, and he himself was quite a prominent leader in his own right. So it's just interesting to note his, marriage to a similarly aged woman. That's at least nice to see, I suppose. So we're actually going to skip over John Taylor and Brigham Young, like most of the other prominent leaders, because their marriages are simply too complex and they require so much time in and of themselves. So next we're going to focus on Theodore Turley. Theodore Turley was born in England in 1801, where he was a mechanic, a gunsmith, a brewer, a farmer, a blacksmith, and a grist mill operator. He first married Frances Amelia Kimberley in 1821, and the new family migrated to Canada in 1825. They were baptized into the church in 1837. They moved to Far West and joined the Mormon exodus to Illinois. Now, because Theodore Turley's old stomping grounds were England, he accompanied the Quorum of the 12 on their mission to England from 1839 to 1841. Theodore Turley continued in leadership positions in the church and was eventually admitted to the Council of 50. He joined the Utah Brighamite congregation in Utah, where he died in Beaver in 1871. Theodore Turley is an interesting case in that he wasn't just sealed to his sister-in-law, but to two of his sisters-in-law, Eliza and Sarah Clift, in March and April of 1844, just a couple of short months before the Carthage shootout. Next, Lyman Wight. He's dealt with in Bergera's article, but he's another prominent leader with a fascinating history during Joe's life and after Joe's death. And the thing is just like a bunch of the other bigger names in all of this article, we're going to have to deal with that in coming episodes. Regardless, evidence for his plural marriages, according to Bergera, relies solely on family tradition, which claims he had 4 wives at the time of the Carthage shootout, 3 of which, quote, were recently acquired, end quote. He was married to Harriet Benton in January 1823, and then, and this is quoting from Lyman Wight's biographer, quote, there was Jane Margaret Ballantyne, 25-year-old daughter of John and Janet Ballantyne, Scottish immigrants with the company. Jane was pregnant and expecting a child in late winter. Then there was Mary Howley, 22-year-old daughter of Pierce and Sarah Howley, Vermonters with the company. The next was Mary Ann Hobart, 17-year-old daughter of Otis and Sophronia Hobart. There, of course, was the ever-faithful Harriet Benton, now age 44, and at the end of her childbearing years. Harriet was old enough to be the other wife's mother. Harriet appears to stoically accept the new and everlasting covenant of plural marriage, or perhaps she welcomed the company. We have no record of her opinion. End quote. Just like the majority of these marriages, we have no record of her opinion. And finally, for today, we turn to Edwin D. Woolley. Edwin Woolley was born in 1807, a farmer, coal miner, cattleman, builder, and a merchant in Pennsylvania. He converted from Quaker to Mormon in 1837. He'd married Mary Wickersham, I guess? I think that's how you pronounce that, in Ohio in 1831. The Woolley family apparently escaped the Missouri Mormon War troubles as he was branch president in East Rochester, Ohio at the time. Edwin Woolley married 2 wives in 1843, Louisa Gordon Rising and Ellen Wilding. In stark contrast to so many of these plural marriages, apparently none of his wives were actually related to each other. So, as I said at the top of the episode, this show is just a data dump. Now, check the show notes for Gary Bergera's article. It is a fascinating read, if a bit long, but hey, you know what? That's what I'm here for, to read these books and articles so that you don't have to. So what kind of analysis can we draw from this data dump today? Well, roughly 28 men and something like 106 women can be documented to have practiced polygamy in Nauvoo prior to Joe and Hiram's deaths. But that doesn't really tell the whole picture, does it? The secretive nature of celestial marriage renders documenting its practice a real challenge, right? But this is only one small detail, one authorized small detail of the darker side of Nauvoo Mormonism. Right? Apologists and faithful members want to claim that, polygamy was for the support of the widows, and when it included a sexual dynamic, those were the rare exceptions. This was a holy and righteous practice, with Mormon leadership only begrudgingly assenting to it because God's commanded it so fiercely. Angels with drawn swords and whatnot. Hubbub, hubbub, hubbub. There is some truth to the assertion that polygamy was to support widows, but to claim such was the norm is boldly dishonest because more of these marriages were dudes marrying their sisters-in-law than they were to marrying widows. Besides, resources were scarce and polygamous couples very rarely cohabited. So it wasn't supporting the widows so much as claiming them, now was it? What about brothels, right? The celestial, the new and everlasting covenant, the celestial marriage, that's the authorized. But what about brothels? What about spiritual wifery that was condemned as an inferior system, but exactly the same in practice? That's the underbelly that can only be speculated on and never documented. Frederick G. Williams, one of the botanical physicians of the church until his death in 1842, he had a special formula he called Bachelor's Delight because imagine the diseases flowing freely around this little fiefdom in the Mississippi. Anybody trying to talk about this that we are discussing today as anything more than a bunch of rich dudes being rewarded with wives They're trying to pound a square peg into a round hole here. In the analysis section of Bergera's article that we've been discussing this whole episode, once again, you'll find a link to it in the show notes. There are a few tables that details some of the statistics of these marriages. And I have a feeling like none of these stats will actually surprise you, but if you factor Joe's marriages out of this, less than 1% of these 106 marriages included a man who was younger than his wife. The youngest man to marry was 18, while the youngest was 13. 63% of these marriages were to women who had never been married before. Only 14% of these marriages were actually widows. The average age of wives in sequence decreased in age, meaning the average age of the first plural wife was 28, the second plural wife was 28, and then the third plural wife was usually 22 years old, while the average age for husbands increased at those intervals. Bergera's breakdown of the leadership roles of polygamous marriages is possibly the most revealing metric of Nauvoo Mormon polygamy. Leadership quorums and groups and bodies in Nauvoo Mormonism included the Anointed Quorum, those who received their second anointing, the Council of 50, and then on the lower end of the leadership ranks, you had the 70s and the high priests. 57% of polygamous marriages were given to men who were in the Anointed Quorum. 39% were given to men who had received their second anointing. 50% were given to men who were members of the Council of 50. And 36% of these marriages went to men who were members of all of these quorums. 26% of these marriages were biological sisters, just dudes who wanted to marry their sisters-in-law. What was Nauvoo polygamy? This is a wife, daughter, sister, sister-in-law, any other relationship you can imagine, swapping ring. This is dozens of dudes in power laying claim to women as property. There's simply no other way of viewing this data. Don't let anybody lie to you by claiming otherwise, because this square data simply doesn't fit in that round hole. And that's going to do it for our episode today. Hopefully this week's episode made up for calling in sick last week, doing the research for all of the biographical information on all of these folks. Really was a bit more time consuming than I expected, but that's my way of saying thank you guys for sticking around, and thanks for giving me a week off to be able to call in sick. And also thank you to quite a few people who reached out and said, hope you get to feeling better. You need to take sick time. That's totally okay. 4.5 years, we can handle a week off. That was just really nice to receive all of those very kind and heartfelt messages. So to everybody who did send those in, thank you so very much. A couple of announcements. When this airs, I'm going to be at Mormon History Association in Salt Lake City. This is June 6th through 9th. It's a little too late to get tickets now, but Mormon History Association is similar to Sunstone and to John Whitmer Historical Association and a few of these other symposia where you just come and sit and chat and hear presentations on peer review Mormon history research. So my hopes are that as I'm, as this is airing, and that I am speaking with various people who I will hopefully be able to sit down and interview, and hopefully that will constitute our next couple of episodes. The reason for that is I have a busy in the middle of June coming up here. I'm actually going to be joining Annie on a 1.5 week long trip down to California, where we are moving her for her internship this month, in the middle of June here. So, coming up, you're still going to be getting episodes every single week, but just to let you know, we're going to take a break from our historical timeline coming up very soon, possibly next episode, possibly the following episode after that, in order to do interviews, because I'm going to be on the road and unable to sit down and do the research for the episodes. During that time, I'm also going to be editing the audio for the History of the Saints, the audio that we have been collecting together for our Nauvoo Book Club. And this is for the patrons only at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You guys are getting this audio of these old Mormon history exposés and important books, and you're getting it with my commentary. Well, I still got to edit out all of the commentary and get that ready to be posted up as an audio book. So that is what I'm going to be doing while we are traveling. So there's, you may not be getting the regular, strict, researched, scripted out episodes in the next few weeks, but there's still a lot going on behind the scenes over here. And I just want to give you guys a little peek behind the curtain of what that kind of looks like. Also, we do have some new patrons to thank, and this is over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Quite the outpouring of support. Let's start off with thank you to Nicholas, to Anne, to Jean, to Kent Ortel, to Alexander, to Chris, to Riley, to Michael, to Ryan, and also to Jeff and Carrie, and a huge thanks to our newest Nemo demon, Adam. Now, all of these people are supporters over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Not only do they get extra episodes every week, but they also get extended editions of the episodes. That's the variety show where I just sit down and chat with the listeners, just sit and hang out for a little while. It's unscripted. It's uncensored. It is just me vomiting into the microphone. If that's something that you like, go sign up at patreon.com/nakedmormonism and join the ranks of these awesome folks. And specifically, I want to thank Adam, that signing up at the Nemo Demon level, that is entering the realm of Outer Darkness. The Outer Darkness patrons are really the people who form the backbone of support for this show. And to them, I thank you so very dearly, to Adam and to all of our Outer Darkness participants in the Nemo family. Thank you all so very much for your support. So just one final announcement to discuss. This is going to take a little bit of a somber turn here. If you guys will listen or remember back to the polygamy series that we did when we were first entering into the Nauvoo Polygamy era, we did this 8-part series about polygamy in early Mormonism and went through the history of polygamy throughout a bunch of human history all the way in through some of Joseph's wives and so on and so forth. As a cap of those episodes, we interviewed a guy named Roy Jeffs. And some of you may actually know Roy Jeffs, a very enigmatic and happy-go-lucky type of interesting guy, friends with everybody who he meets. Unfortunately, Roy Jeffs died by his own hand this last week. And this is a death that has really reverberated throughout the community. And a lot of people are taking it really hard. It's a really, really tough situation. Roy has a very complicated history behind him, growing up in FLDS as one of the Jeffs, one of Warren Jeff's sons, one of the first of the Jeffs to leave the commune and to leave the FLDS church. He's got a tough history, and unfortunately his demons overtook him. So there's going to be a funeral service. You can check Lindsay Hanson Park's Facebook page for details on that. Should you be interested in attending, I will be attending. There's also a GoFundMe for covering the funeral costs for the Jeffs family in order to give him a proper burial and whatnot. That's GoFundMe.com/Roy's funeral costs. You'll find a link to it in the show notes if that's something that you would like to donate to. If that's a cause that you feel is worthy of casting in a couple of bucks, the family could really use help covering those costs. It's always a tragedy when one of these things happens. When somebody does take their own life, it's tough. So a lot of people are really hurting from this. So I'll just take this opportunity to publicly express my condolences to all of the people who were attached to Roy, the people through family, through friendships, through deep, deep friendships who had, helped him extricate himself from the life of FLDS and the cult mentality. There's a lot of people who are feeling this, and I'm very, very sorry for your loss. So with that, we'll go ahead and close it out on this bit of a somber note. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast.
This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.